In South Africa, we like to believe that we have 11 official languages, which makes sense given that Section 6.1 of the Constitution clearly states 11 official languages in the country. The reality, however, I think, is far from satisfactory, given that indigenous African languages, i.e. the non-Indo-European languages that are spoken in this country and recognized by Section 6.1 of the Constitution as being official languages in a formal context, don't seem to enjoy the same status in other areas of social life, particularly outside of casual conversation and social institutions like church. Section 240 of the Constitution states that if there is a dispute in understanding between different translations of the Constitution, the English version takes precedence. Now, we can say, okay, we understand that because we've got different languages, they've got different philosophical traditions, and there's different semantic understandings of certain phrases that may make technical and detailed analysis quite difficult and can therefore result in conflicts when comparing two languages. Giving English this status as the language above all languages insofar as resolving constitutional matters sort of gives the signal that when this country was transitioning from apartheid to the democratic dispensation, there was a subconscious understanding that Indo-European languages, particularly English, were going to play a significant role in the country going forward. And that is somewhat understandable given that nevertheless shows and underpins the fact that South African indigenous languages don't receive and are not accorded not even comparable status, because I think that's too much to ask for at this stage given the realities we see, but status as official languages of any nature. In an attempt to bring effect to the provisions of the Constitution relating to the promotion of indigenous African languages as official languages and their use within the public sphere, the government in 2012 passed the Use of Official Languages Act. And for the most part, the legislation simply encourages and promotes and requires plans and policies to be passed by national departments and other state organs for the promotion of official languages. But it does not actually impose obligations to do so. And given the glacial pace of development in regards to the use of official languages for official, commercial, and academic purposes, it can be reasonably construed that this legislation has been less than effective. And given that the same government has been in power since not only the end of apartheid, but since the legislation was introduced, we can reasonably discern that the government may either not be prioritizing this, of which the promotion of African languages may be competing with other priorities more broadly, or there are other constraints. Chief among them, I suspect, is political will. An interesting development in the way that languages are handled within the South African context is the Basic Education Laws Amendment Act, which amends several acts, including the South African Schools Act, and empowers heads of education to intervene with respect to admissions and language policies at South African schools, which was seen as a constraint in enabling communities that are developing around schools to be recognized within the mediums of instructions that those schools may use. So this particular legislation arises from a case that happened whereby Ermelo High School was compelled by the head of department to switch its, or add, I believe, another language of instruction. So Ermelo High School was Afrikaans, and it was asked to switch or to add English as a medium of instruction to reflect the change in the communities around it, so that students who didn't speak Afrikaans could access the resources that were available at that school. And at the time, because of the way that the South African Schools Act was written, this was not able to be actioned after successive cases and appeals thereof had taken place. So the Basic Education Laws Amendment Act aims to remedy that. And part of the concern that was raised by Afrikaner predominant organizations, and they usually ignore this historical aspect of it, is that given the economic inequality between black and white people, of whom the preponderance of white people were speaking Afrikaans and black people were not, as well as the unequal distribution of national resources more broadly by the government that was in power, Afrikaans and English medium predominant schools, particularly those located within suburbs, were significantly well-resourced, and the legacy of that investment manifests in that the schools have resources and capacity that the fee-free and or low-fee schools, which are quintiles 1 to quintile 4 within the broader South African space and that do provide native languages, do not. So this law can sort of be seen as maybe some movement in the direction of promoting African languages, particularly in spaces where they've not necessarily enjoyed the same level of esteem. However, given that indigenous African languages are not explicitly promoted by the provisions relating to languages as being the focus of that particular act, and given that the act was only recently passed and the president only cited recently, it's still unclear the extent to which this legislation will actually concretize and or catalyze the policies and or actions of the government to encourage the use of African languages more broadly. Various universities have, as state organs, attempted to implement and or draft language policies, and the Pan-South African Language Board, which is responsible for the promotion and regulation of languages that are spoken within South Africa, gave guidelines as to how languages are meant to be addressed by universities given the geographic locations and the demographics that surround them. It is interesting that most universities have taken the approach of encouraging students to enroll in courses where they learn some components of the languages that they are prescribed and or encouraged to promote. However, I am not sure, especially looking at the courses that are offered by the universities as well as entrance requirements, that outside of courses specifically devoted to the teaching of the particular language, that there is an effort to disseminate or proliferate the use of African languages within fields such as commerce, science, a lot of the humanities, etc. It's interesting as well that there is historic precedent for a language being promoted and being given esteem, and that is Afrikaans. I mean, it arose as what was then known as Kombeistal, which was predominantly a pidgin version of Dutch that was spoken by the indigenous and or foreign, that being Malaysian and Indian immigrants who were brought in either through indentured servitude or as economic migrants, whereby they then began speaking this pidgin version of Dutch, and which eventually was adopted, although some activists will say co-opted, by the quote-unquote descendants of the Boers, that being the self-proclaimed Afrikaners, and it was then developed from being just another Creole of Dutch to being a self-standing language, one particularly that could use in scientific and academic contexts, as is exemplified by the fact that despite the fact that, again, apartheid and therefore the domination, politically at least, of English and Afrikaans ended in 1994, many laws in South Africa are passed in Afrikaans and English. Many public functions are available almost exclusively in Afrikaans and English, including government websites, publications, and court proceedings, which is interesting given that, particularly in the case of court proceedings, the Law Society of South Africa had reported on and added comments to what was then known as the South African Language Act and was subsequently passed as the Use of Official Languages Act of 2012, where they were critical of the extent to which the government was just not doing enough to promote the use of African languages in court proceedings, in litigation, and in legal education. An area that is still not as far ahead as one would have expected, given how long it has been that the particular legislation was passed and that the apartheid regime collapsed. To be fair, some provinces more than others can argue that they've made significantly more progress and that some of the concerns have been somewhat addressed. For example, what I've experienced in the Western Cape is that there is a lot of signage on public buildings that is translated into isiXhosa, which is the indigenous language that has been chosen for the Western Cape, in addition to English and Afrikaans. And from some of the provincial acts that I've read, they are typically translated into Afrikaans and isiXhosa as well. So one could say it's a sign of progress. And that is not to say that no moves have been done, as I've listed initiatives, including legislation and policies that the government have undertaken, and that society more broadly has demonstrated progress in the direction of. What we are saying is that it's just not enough. Because when you specifically have the reference of foreign countries, and that's not necessarily to say that everything they do is right, but in an area such as this, there are definitely reasonable lessons to learn. When you see public signage, road signage, when you see commercial activity, when you see scientific work being done in the indigenous languages of those people, it gives one the sense that, damn, we wish that something similar could be taking place in our own country, whose rich tapestry of languages we claim is a boon that makes our country attractive, that makes our country inspiring, that makes our people uniquely interesting, and is a treasure. Yet it needs to be treated like a treasure and needs to find expression outside of interpersonal or cultural use. And that's not to trivialize those areas, but it's to say that in addition to that, we need to start seeing progress in other realms. And I think one of the troubling examples that was demonstrated quite recently was when the Deputy Speaker of Parliament, I believe her name is Dr. Annelie Lotriet, who is a representative in Parliament of the Democratic Alliance, when she was presiding over the plenary session of the National Assembly, struggled to do so in light of the fact that there were limited translation services, if any, available that day, when other members of Parliament wanted to deliver their speeches and speak in an African language.
No, but the same thing happened. Lendo yenzeka ibiyenzekile
You are now, let me put it this way, honorable colleagues.
No, but we need fanele si understand into okubana lento yenzekayo namhlanje yongafika interpreters
Honorable
na izo
member,
iyenzekile. So funeka thina sinyenzelekile into yokuba sithethe isingesi.
I fully
Sinyenzelekile thina ukuba sithethe
appreciate
isingesi.
your point, but I would expect
No,
of you
but
as
akufanelanga yenzeke oko. Because yenzekile izolo iyenzeka namhlanje. Into yokubana thina singakwazi uzi-expressa. Kaloku
honorable
so
members,
makasifumele sithethe languages zethu kaloku le nto siyithethayo.
honorable members, order.
And what's interesting is that when Utogo Didiza, the incumbent Speaker of Parliament, was presiding over sessions, people could speak in pretty much any language and they'd face no issues with her being able to administer the processes of Parliament. And that's not to say that all quote-unquote white South Africans do not speak any indigenous languages, but it is to say that we simply do not see the same proclivity toward multilingualness in that particular community, and of which the incident with Dr. Annelie Latreat, if that is indeed her name, demonstrates as an example. And to be quite frank, it's not possible to argue that South African indigenous languages are not well used. For instance, we can see in a lot of our media, including in series that are being broadcast on streaming services such as Netflix, as well as on South African platforms such as the SABC and ETV, that South African languages are being used. South African languages are alive and well with robust communities. We can also see in that there are publications in indigenous languages, namely newspapers and magazines. We can see in the fact that South African music that is sung in indigenous South African languages is being proliferated throughout the world, particularly in the form of amapiano as well as international acts, such as the Soweto Gospel Choir, who won an award for their work overseas. So it is apparent that South African indigenous languages are supported by robust communities. It is apparent that there are stable and self-proliferating populations that are speaking and writing in these languages. So these languages are alive. They're not going extinct. They're not dying out. Clearly, there must be some other challenge in place that is construing. And there is a paper that was published by an author writing under the Rhodes University, who stated rather interestingly, and I'll put that in the description of this video along with other references so that you can peruse it yourself. Part of the challenge that we face, at least socially, and we're not sure to what extent that is reflected in the way that our policymakers think, is that South African indigenous languages are not seen as languages of civilizational advancement and economic progress in the same way that English and Afrikaans are, which is quite a pity because there are a lot of countries that don't speak Indo-European languages at all, and even those that do, that don't speak English in particular, that are economically prosperous and are often seen as civilizationally advanced, and where the majority of the native population, the language that they speak is reflected in official, commercial, and academic contexts, not merely cultural or interpersonal ones. And over and above the historical legacies that have made it difficult for Black people to advance economically, at least to the extent of becoming equal, at least economically, to their peers in minority communities, particularly the white one. Part of the constraint in being able to achieve that level of social mobility is in the fact that the African indigenous languages that are spoken by the majority of the people are not the languages that are being used as widely as they ought. So these are the kinds of challenges that will continue to undermine our economic progress, that will continue to undermine our social cohesion and building interracial and intercultural peace. So hopefully these are things that we will continue to see positive moves and strides in the direction of. Please post your comments if you have any thoughts on the topic, any corrections that you'd like to make, and please see the description below for references to the things that I've been saying throughout the video. And thank you so much for engaging.